absolutely wild as Vern Gagne's All-Star Wrestling goes coast to coast and continent to continent. The greatest wrestlers in the world.
He may be an apprentice carpenter, but I guarantee you he is a seasoned ring veteran.
I've been hit with bar stools, bar rags, barmaids.
I'm talking to you.
They're scared that Hulkamania's still running wild. Oh, yeah. I got a big fat wife and 9 kids at home, and I gotta feed them.
And take a look at Jesse the Body in real life.
Open your hand once, if you would.
You want to see it?
This is absolutely unbelievable. Totally, completely out of control.
He's coming in over the top. Hey! Look out!
And welcome into this week's edition of AWA Unleashed. We are the preeminent #1 podcast dedicated to telling the stories and reliving the memories of the American Wrestling Association. My name is Chris Stubbs. If you're a fan of the podcast, you know the deal. Now, I'm going to hand it off to Mick Karch and also Polish Joe Chupik. Boys, I'm not going to waste a whole lot of time because I've already wasted 90 seconds. And if anybody's still here, I'll be amazed. But you don't want to tune out because this is, out of the almost 90 episodes that we've done, this might be one of my favorites. I'm looking forward to this one immensely. And for wrestling fans, just let me say this. You're going to introduce this individual, Mick. But as you guys know, he doesn't need an introduction.
No, he certainly does not. But having said that, it's my honor to introduce him, not only from his days in the AWA and the WWF and the NWA and everywhere else, but also the American Wrestling Federation, where I had an opportunity to work with him. One of the most famous and respected professional wrestlers, I don't even want to say of the modern era. Let's just say of all time. And let's bring him in, our good friend, Tito Santana. There he is.
How you guys doing? Thank you so much for having me on. And, man, that makes me feel good.
Well, Tito, it's our pleasure. And again, when you talk about the respected wrestlers in the business, and not only from the fans, but from the peers, from the guys, I honestly don't know if I've ever heard anybody say a bad word about Tito Santana, and that's a shoot. You're one hell of a respected individual, and it is our pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much. I just treated everybody the way I wanted to be treated, and without our fans, none of us would be anybody. So whenever I go to appearances, I like to give the fans, the well-deserved time, and I like, I don't like to blow them off. They want to talk to me, and I enjoy hearing their stories.
Oh, and that's so refreshing, because we've been to so many of these fan events where the guys don't even look up from the picture they're signing, and then they kind of herd them through like cattle. So that,
as long as the check cashes, then we're kind of afterthoughts. So I'm kind of with Mick as a fan. I've never heard anybody say a bad word about Tito Santana, and that's pretty remarkable.
Class is the simplest way to state it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no question about it. And in this business, Tito, man, that's you're in rarefied air there, pal. I'll tell you that.
It wasn't an easy business, without a doubt.
Well,
go ahead, Joe. I know you got the first question up on the team.
Yeah. So Tito, in Minnesota, we've got Robbinsdale, Minnesota. That was the hotbed. But explain to us what was in the water at West Texas State. You had so many guys come through there. Can you list off some of the famous people that came out of West Texas State University?
Well, the Funks, Terry and Dory, Dusty Rhodes, Blackjack Mulligan, Barry Windham, Manny Fernandez, Bruiser Brody, Stan Hansen, Bobby Duncombe, myself, and I'm pretty sure I've missed a couple. I guess the reason was the fact that Funks were stationed in or are from Kenyon, Texas, and they also played football at West Texas State. So, yes, a lot of great. A lot of them were football players, also, like myself.
Boy,
Yeah,
what a
see that in
rogues
the
gallery!
photo.
I mean that is something else. And look at that young guy there, boy.
Yeah, this was when I was with the BC Lions.
Wow, how many years ago?
Well, this was in 1976, so 43, I would say.
Wow. And you haven't aged a bit. Outside of the glasses, Tito, you're the same guy.
No. When I roll out of bed, I know I'm not the same guy.
So was wrestling always kind of in your sights, Tito, or like how did you get connected with the professional wrestling business?
Well, I forgot to mention one guy, and that was Tully Blanchard.
Sure.
He was the quarterback at West Texas State, and so was the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase. We played together. I wasn't a wrestling fan when I grew up, but I met Tully's father, and one day Tully tells me that his father thinks that I can have a great career being Mexican American in professional wrestling, and he planted a seed. At the time, I wasn't interested because it was my junior year in college. I had been getting letters from the NFL that I was a prospect, and football was my first love. When I found out, I went to Kansas City as a free agent. I found out that it wasn't an easy way to make a living, and I started thinking more about giving wrestling a shot, and the rest is history.
So when you decided to make the jump, Tito, to wrestling, and you had mentioned the Blanchard clan, how exactly did you get involved? Was it through that group? Was it another contact? How'd you first get into the business?
Well, when I got done with the BC Lions in 1976, I came back to college. Tully Blanchard graduated mid-year, and we went back to San Antonio, Texas. I didn't even go home. I went to San Antonio, and I started training a little bit with Tully, and I refereed a few matches because they own Southwest Texas wrestling. And then him and I drove on the last day of 1976, and then my first day of training in Tampa, Florida with Hiro Matsuda was in 1977, January 1st. I'll never forget that.
Wow. That was going to be my next question too, is about the training. And boy, Hiro Matsuda doesn't get much better than that. That's one hell of a way to get your feet wet.
Yeah, he definitely had a reputation. I think the fact that I was recommended by, the Funks, the Blanchards, he was a tough. I mean, his training was tough, but he was easy on me.
Well, that's good. That's a plus.
So when you first got into it then, Tito, was it what you had expected? Like what kind of expectations did you have? And I mean, what was it like on the road when you're just getting your feet wet?
Well, I mean, coming from professional wrestling, I was there as a free agent when we worked in our contract, and I got a contract, and I was kind of, professional football player, professional wrestling. I was expecting something similar. And when that didn't happen, and I start training, and I'm not making any money, and then I ended up having 4 matches in Florida before I went to Atlanta, and I was spending more money than I was making, in the matches. Terry Funk happened to come he was the world champion, came into Tampa, and he called me into the dressing room because back then they used to separate the baby faces and the heels. And he asked me how I was liking it. God bless his soul, Terry Funk, may he rest in peace. he says, "How do you like it?" I said, "Well, I like it." I said, "But I don't know if I can afford to keep doing this because I was paying for an apartment." And I said, "I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to just, because I had signed a contract to go back to play for the BC Lions. I said, I think I'm just going to give it up and start training for football again and give it another shot next year." And he said, "No, don't, just wait a minute. Let me talk to Eddie Graham." And that's what happened. The next morning, Eddie Graham called me into his office, and that's when I got my first match. And before you know it, I was on my way to Atlanta, Georgia.
Wow. Fantastic.
So I want to talk to you about this little name shuffle game when you first started. You used the name Richard Blood, but that's Ricky Steamboat's real name. So how the heck how did you come about to use Richard Blood when you first started in the biz?
Well, the owner of Georgia Championship Wrestling was Jim Barnett, and Ricky Steamboat had been in Georgia Championship Wrestling before he went to North Carolina to work for the Crockett's, and he went on to become a big star for the Crockett's. So I guess Jim Barnett, feeling that he lost a big star, that they should have kept him, he thought that he could replace Ricky Steamboat with the fake Richard Blood. And from what I understand, Jim Barnett flew to Charlotte to get permission from Ricky Steamboat for me to use the name Richard Blood. So that's how I became Richard Blood.
Wow. So speaking of this, I don't like to, because I'm not in the business, so I don't like to use the insider terms. There was never any documentation that, Ricky Steamboat ever worked as a villain. Did you ever work as a bad guy, or were you always, the fan favorite?
I was always a baby face. I don't know if you remember when Rick Martel and I split up in Strikeforce. I asked Vince McMahon if I could be the heel when we split up, and he said no. He said, I still got a few plans for you, which he never did have any more plans. He just kind of.
Imagine that.
Yeah, and just speaking of the Strikeforce thing, I got to admit, like at that WrestleMania, and one of my first WWF shows that I went to was actually where you were supposed to wrestle Rick Martel, and you were on your way to the ring, and he attacked you in the on your way, and I was so upset. Like, as a kid, I was just like, how can you do that to Tito? I hate you, and I was just like, oh man, I was so mad at Rick Martel, and I still am. Like, to this day, I still can't forgive Rick Martel for not giving me that Rick Martel Tito Santana match that I wanted to see in person.
I think that's what's missing now in modern wrestling. People would get into the situations, the stories back then, and I guess I don't know if they were more thought out or the minds behind this were more prepared. I think what's going on now is Hollywood writers are the ones that are writing, and if they've never been in the ring, it's pretty hard to create scenarios.
Tito, what a great point that is. And to me, and I've said this before on this podcast, as a wrestling fan, there doesn't seem to be an emotional connection with the guys that there was back in the day. I mean, if the babyface was getting his ass kicked back in the day, the fans were ready to riot. Now it's such a television production that everybody really, hey, we're just watching the TV show and we're supposed to cheer here and we're supposed to cheer there, and the lines between babyface and heel are kind of blurred. So the storylines don't matter. I mean, you can't get a guy over as a massive baby face anymore because half the crowd doesn't like him.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of today's wrestling. I don't watch it. I happened to be in a show, in a live show. I didn't even know it was going to be a wrestling show. I thought it was an appearance here in Jersey, and the building held like 7,000 people, and they only had like half the building was full, and pretty much 90% of the wrestlers, weighed around 200, 210. They all look the same, and that was the night that Rhodes was introduced to the WWE.
Okay.
So I mean, back in the day, I mean, there was a heel, and not too many fans wanted to step into the ring and challenge those heels. I mean, they were mean looking and big and tough, and nowadays, I think as myself, if I was on the side watching a match, I wouldn't be afraid of to go into the ring, and challenge some of these guys.
I know exactly what you're saying, and a lot of them, it's cookie cutter. A lot of them look so much the same, and it looks like swimmers or gymnasts or whatever.
Well, yeah, there's no difference. Like you said, I mean, I'm used to wrestlers, like everybody had their own look. They had their own personality. It's like there was something that I could grab onto, whether I liked somebody or I hated somebody. Like it got me attached to them. And I feel detached from a lot of today's wrestling because there's no reason for me as a fan to invest my time and consequently my money.
Well, you had guys like Jerry Blackwell, for example. I mean, he was an overweight guy that could drop kick.
Yeah.
And most of these guys were, even though they were huge, George the Animal Steel, and you could just go on naming down the road, huge guys that could eat you up, and spit you out if they wanted to. These were tough guys, they were very athletic.
No question about it. And, I guess because we're an AWA podcast, we should start talking about the AWA a little bit and, kind of focus on that. So as your career is progressing, you come to the AWA territory and boy, it exploded. But how did you get involved? How did you get hooked up with the AWA to begin with?
Well, when I left New York, I had teamed up with Ivan Putski in 1979, and we became the World Tag Team champions. We dropped the belts to the Samoans, the Wild Samoans, and Vince McMahon Sr., I kind of made him my whoever was going to be booking me. So every move that I made from there on, I took his advice. So he asked me, where do you want to go? And Dino Bravo, God bless his soul, happened to be there. And he had, we kept in contact because we were friends. And he told me that there was a great territory. You could live a normal life. Everywhere else, you were wrestling every day of the year. In Minnesota, you'd wrestle 200 days a year and, made pretty good money. So I told Vince, my first choice is to go to the AWA.
That's great. And that actually leads to my next question too, because you've done so much in the business in so many different territories and countries for that matter. Your time in the AWA, how does that rank, in the list, if you had to say, this is my favorite period of my career, whatever, favorite territory, how does the AWA stack up?
Well, not that it's my favorite territory, but I credit the AWA for me learning the business. I had my first feud with Ednan LKC. God bless his soul, just passed away recently. You guys know, every guy that was there was a main eventer anywhere else.
Oh.
And the interviews were unbelievable. And me and Gene Okerlund, I wasn't experienced with interviews because I remember Mad Dog Vachon used to say 90% of the draw is your interviews. That's where you sell your tickets. Sure. 10% is the work you do in the ring. And to listen to these guys, do the interviews, and how they used to sell tickets, it was unbelievable. So I feel that that's the place that I learned the most And when I went back to New York, I felt like I was polished. You know, I could do I could compete with interviews with anybody. I could. My work was. I learned a lot. You know, because I was working with top guys. You know, I was learning, and guys were teaching you, and that's what we used to do. The older guys would teach the young guys, and you know, it's pretty easy if you're an athlete to learn when you're getting taught every night. Every night, you know, they lead you like a baby in that ring, and you know, I was there for 2 years, and you know, I really learned a lot.
Oh, you're muted, Chris.
So I was working on some things behind the scenes. Thank you for that. Otherwise, I mean, maybe my wife muted it for me. I don't know. So when you're there, Tito, and you know, you mentioned all of these individuals were main eventers in other territories. Like, what was the atmosphere like amongst the talent? Was there like this competitiveness that everybody kind of wanted that top spot because everybody was main eventers, or was everybody? It's kind of like all ships rise sort of situation where everybody's willing to help each other out.
I think everybody was willing to help each other out. Everybody, you know, Vince didn't keep a big roster, and everybody would have a little run, and then you would drop a little, and somebody else would go up, and you know, everybody. Vern was making the most out of everybody that he had, because you know, you'd wrestle in Minneapolis or St. Paul, you know, where you had 15, 20,000 people, and Vern had like maybe 5 matches.
Exactly.
You know, you'd have 3 matches and before intermission and 2 after intermission, and you know, everywhere else they had 8, 9, 10 matches, and you know, in the AWA, 5 matches we were selling out. You know, not, you know, I was part of it, but they were selling out way before me with that scenario.
Wow. So Tito, my question is going to be a 2-parter. So you were with the AWA during, I mean, it was hot from about 81 to 80, probably 80 to 83 was arguably the most successful period of the AWA. Part 1 of the question that I have is, the Exodus started in, I believe it was May of 94. And that was Jesse, Mean Gene, Bobby.
84?
Pardon?
84.
84.
Yeah, sorry.
You said 9. I'm like, oh, it was way
May
different.
of 84. My bad. And then, you know, Dr. D, David Schultz. So my question to you is, how and when were you approached to go back to the WWF at the time?
Well, I was in Atlanta. I went from the AWA to Atlanta. They promised me they were going to make me a big international star. Ole Anderson was the booker. Well, another big screw job that never happened. Ole never had any intentions before I know it. I started getting booked in Louisiana. Bill Watts wanted to get me to Louisiana. Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff told me that the trips were very far, always on the road, and the pay was not good. So I told Ole, I don't want to go to Louisiana. And before you know it, I get booked in Louisiana, and I get a great payday for the period that I was there. And then I would come back to Atlanta, and Paul told me, you know, he really wants you bad, but once you're there, you're going to get the screw job, I guarantee you. So I kept telling him, I don't want to go. Finally, I wanted to talk to Bill Watts about coming in, and Bill Watts says, I'll talk to you in Houston. And I said, man, he wanted me so bad, now he doesn't even have time to talk to me. So I called Vince McMahon, and I said, Vince, I'm going to be talking to Bill Watts on Friday. I think I'm going to go to Louisiana. And Bill Watts says, Bill Watts is a good man. So come Friday, I get there. Ernie Led tells me, son, you're going to have to make the biggest decision of your life tonight. He says, New York, Vince McMahon wants you really bad. and Bill Watts wants you really bad. So I felt like I was in control again. It was a pretty depressing era that I kept going back and forth because I had a guarantee. Only got rid of my guarantee in Georgia, so I was making good money in Louisiana, and Ole was, I think I was making like $300 a week working for Ole in Atlanta. And I called Vince and I said, Vince, this Tito, and like he didn't talk for a while, and I felt like it was hours that he just was silent, and I was getting upset, and I said, don't tell me that Vince is on this gimmick work also. And I was kind of getting upset, and I raised my voice a little bit, and I said, the reason I called you is because I was asked to call you. And he says, yep, it's time for you to come home. Your starting date is May 10th, 1983. Was my first TV taping. The reason I remember that is because that was my birthday. So, I told my wife we're going home because my wife was from New Jersey.
Nice. So once you got to, May 10th of 83, so that was a couple of years before the first WrestleMania, before the WWF exploded, if you will. So you were there when all of the talent from all of the different territories started coming in. What was it like in the locker room, or just for yourself? What did the talent think of the other territories? Did you see the direction that Vince McMahon Jr. wanted to take wrestling? And if so, did you think that there was going to be any competition, or could you see what the WWF was going to become, what it is today, this huge multi-billion-dollar conglomerate?
Well, Vince Sr. came down with cancer, and they had a meeting, and he handed over the reins to Vinny. We used to call him Vinny. Now he's Vince. And he had a big meeting with all of us, and it was introduced to us very slowly. It was happening, but only the inside, probably Pat Patterson, the bookers knew really what was going on. But first it started out, I figured he went and got the best Mexican, which was me. He went and got the best black, which was JYD. He went and got Hogan. He offered Hogan a 10-year guarantee. And he just kept getting talent. And then before you know it, we're going into Minnesota. We're going into Atlanta. We're going into, he's taking over all the big cities. I don't know if this is true, and I'm not gonna. It's a good source that I heard it from, but I heard that Vince would go in with Hulk and ask the TV producer or the president, how much are you getting from the AWA? How much are you paying them? And he said, we give him $1,000 a week. And Vince would say, how about if I give you $1,000 and you put a better product? So it was like a no-brainer,
Man.
Yeah, I've heard that story as well from Vern and Greg back in the day. So
at that point, Tito, when we see all of the talent from these other territories are going up to New York to the WWF, when did Vince view the AWA as a threat anymore, or was it just kind of, I'm going to take the talent and I'm going to bleed this territory dry until there's nothing left? I mean, was there any perception of what the AWA was at that point when you got to New York again?
No, because when the takeover started, all of a sudden, we're going into Minneapolis, and with all this talent, with a lot of talent, and there's no way that Vern could compete. anymore. Greg tried to get us to go back, but I was making more money than I had ever made, in my career. So I mean, there's no way that I was gonna go from a proven product that had treated me good to go back to a product that let me go. It was a no-brainer. Everything was shifting, and Vince was taking over. There was a period where the boys didn't understand what was going on, but Vince didn't allow any of the magazine writers to come into the dressing rooms.
Right.
So there was no WWF articles on the magazines, and the boys were getting upset about that. And all of a sudden, here comes WWF magazine.
Yeah.
And I mean, the script, the foresight that he had. I mean, I don't know who else was along with that, but looking back, it was genius.
Oh, it absolutely was. And there's always that age-old argument. Did Vern drop the ball? Did he not keep up with the times? I think you said it all. When WWF is coming back into Minneapolis, and they're coming in with these guys that had all been stars here, they'd already been established here, and he literally took Vern's main event guys at the time, Schultz and Hogan, and Mean Gene, and everybody, and
Bobby Heenan.
Oh, everybody, yeah. And to me, when Jim Brunzell left, I mean, of all people, when one of the high flyers leaves, I think to me that kind of said, well, there you go, you lost a Minnesota guy, and game over.
Yeah, I agree. Jumping Jim, but he's a great guy. I was totally surprised when all of a sudden he showed up, and I happened to be in the I was a very lucky man. I mean, I was in Minnesota in 1979. Hulk got there. We both went. I went to the AWA. Hulk got there. From what I understand, the Rocky movie, Rocky sent 3 letters, and Hulk was the only one that answered it. And he went and became Rocky. They brought him in as a heel. You were there, Mick. The fans just weren't buying him as a heel. So they had to get rid of his manager, Valiant, and turn him into a babyface. And all of a sudden, the territory starts selling out everywhere. So I was making money because I was there with Hulk. Then I came back to New York, and here comes Hulk. Became the champion, and I was there for many, many years. So a lot of people knock Hulk. Hulk couldn't work like Tito Santana. Hulk worked like Hulk. Mm-hmm. But Hulk drew a lot of money. I consider him the Elvis of professional wrestling.
So let the record show that wherever you were at, Hulk had to follow. So really, Hulk Hogan was following Tito Santana. Let's make that perfectly clear.
He knew where to go.
That's perfect. All right, we're gonna take a little different turn here, Tito, because we want to talk about some of the guys that you worked with in the AWA. So we're gonna do kind of a name association, and I will bring up the name or names of some of the guys, and just brief recollection of your time and your assessment of them, friendships, what have you. So. We're going to kick it off. We had mentioned Jim Brunzell. You talked about Greg Gagne. So talk about the High Flyers a little bit. Your impressions maybe of them as individuals or the tag team.
Well, the High Flyers, Greg was the son of Vern Gagne.
Yep.
And they had been there for many, many years. And you would hear a lot of people knocking, especially not so much Brunzell, but Greg, because he was so small and stuff. Well, I don't know if you remember when Rick Martel and I had that feud with the High Flyers.
I sure do.
And when I ended up working with Greg, I found that Greg, to me, had one of the better minds in the business in the ring. So I figured, this guy deserves what he gets. He doesn't deserve the negativity that the boys were talking about. Of course, big guys that had to put him over, the father was the owner of the territory. But could the guy work? He could outwork anybody in the ring. There's no doubt in my mind. I mean, I learned a lot from him.
You had mentioned you and Martel against the Flyers, and I got to say, as a fan, watching the two teams in St. Paul, one of the greatest matches I've seen. I mean, it was just from top to bottom. It had everything and just stellar.
And we used to go. I don't know if you remember. There was a feud that lasted for a while. We had hour matches, and we were able to keep the fans on their feet. Throughout. I think the fans were looking forward for us to beat them. They wanted me and Rick which I think would have been a great thing because we could have kept on working with those guys with them chasing us. But no, I mean the fans really bought into Rick Martel and Tito Santana, and the High Flyers were already established.
Let's move on to another team that was quite established back then, and that is the East-West Connection, Ventura and Adonis. I mean, we know who the wrestler of the two was. We know who the talker of the two was. But your impressions of them?
Well, it was always a pleasure stepping into the ring with those guys. I really enjoyed working with Jesse. I mean, because Jesse could get heat without much work in the ring. Just let him do his thing. With Adrian was a hard worker. Adrian was very talented. He was a hard worker and a great combination together. God bless his soul. I believe that he went too young.
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. And you're right, Jesse. All Jesse had to do was appear. He didn't even have to get in the ring, and he had heat. Let's talk about a man that you had mentioned earlier. To me, one of the underrated guys, but as a heel, as a baby face, later on in his career, Jerry Blackwell.
Well, I remember when I got there, and he wasn't a hot item when I got there.
Right.
But and he was getting beat, in the middle of the ring, doing jobs on TV. I couldn't understand this, and he would come out on his interviews and say, "Still undefeated," and people bought into that, and before you know it, he's the hottest baby face and the hottest heel in the territory. I mean, this guy was hot for years there.
He was just an amazing athlete, and
and a good talker too.
Oh yeah, I mean that's absolutely, and God bless him. Anyway, moving on. Here's a guy that I'm quite familiar with, and I know you are as well, and that is Mr. Bockwinkel.
Mr. Bockwinkel, to me, what a look he had. Handsome heel, good-looking athlete. And, I mean, I had my first hour match with Nick Bockwinkel in Denver, Colorado, if you can imagine, the altitude.
Oh.
And they warned me about Nick. They said he likes to lay on you and tire you out. And sure enough, he did. But he carried me for an hour. It was my first match, and he was a machine. He was a great worker. He knew how to put his opponents over in the mic and in the ring, and he maintained the belt. I mean, he reminded me of Tarzan. He was what a specimen he was.
Yeah, he was incredible, and I go back to thinking even as late as 1986 when he's going to a 60-minute Broadway with Kurt Hennig in Las Vegas, and Nick was, I think, 52, 53 years old at the time. And, Kurt says, the guy blew me up, halfway through the match, my tongue's hanging out, and Nick is, come on, kid. So, extraordinary athlete. And I appreciate knowing that you guys went to those hour Broadways and legendary. Continuing on, we talked about a guy that you are more than familiar with, and that is Rick Martel.
Rick Martel was the ideal baby face in the ring. As you know, I guess having that Canadian French accent, he wasn't one of the greatest talkers in the world, but he was a great worker, and he was a great partner. And when him and I got teamed up as Strikeforce, and then they turned him into the model, and I mean, he did an unbelievable job as the model. That was the man. He got over like $1 million. I guess turning against me was very appropriate, and he went on, to do very good things. I just wish that him and I would have had a longer feud in the WWF.
Absolutely. Great stuff. And, my impression of Martel was always poor Rick in the scheme of things in the AWA as a heavyweight champion. In a different era, he might have been just gold, but unfortunately, he had to follow, in the footsteps of guys like Hogan and et cetera. And the AWA was starting their downhill decline a little bit. So I don't think he got over as champion as best as he could have, but still, what an amazing guy.
Yes, he was.
We're moving on, and legendary is all I can say about this guy. And so many people have said that he's the greatest overall wrestling talent in history, and that's Bobby Heenan. And everybody has Bobby Heenan stories, and I know you worked with Bobby incessantly everywhere. Talk about the Brain.
Well, the Brain was a master, with what he had to offer as far as his body goes. He could go in there and he could work with anybody. It doesn't make any difference. He was a big coward, but he would get his shots in there, and he would hide behind whoever, and nobody could out talk this guy. I mean, he was unbelievable. The way he talked about me in the interviews, did nothing but help me.
Right.
The same thing with Jesse the Body. The heels knew how to get baby faces over with the comments. I don't think nowadays they'd be allowed to use the language that they used back then. But he was one of the best, as a ring wrestler and as a manager.
You said it all, and I remember Nick would always say if he and Ray Stevens were booked for a territory or a show somewhere, and one of them could not make it, and they put Bobby Heenan in the place, the match was probably better than it would have been. So, I mean, what an extraordinary talker! And I remember those interviews where he was putting the heat on you, and $1 million bucks worth $1 million. What a guy!
Yeah, he could do it with everybody, though. I mean, he would pick, he was one of the few gifted guys. I put him up there, probably even better than, God, all of a sudden, my mind went blank. Piper.
Oh, yes.
There's another comparison right there. I mean, these guys just had the gift.
Yeah, sad that they're no longer with us, but in wrestling history, man, they carved a niche never to be equaled. Speaking of guys like that, you talked about him a little bit, and a guy that would get knocked for what he could do in the ring, but in terms of the money that he drew, Hulk Hogan.
Well, I mean, Hulk Hogan, a lot of people, like I said, knock him and compare him to other guys. The Rock, the era of the Rock, Stone Cold Steve Austin, the WWE was on fire, but I think Hogan was the guy that made it all possible. He just happened to be there at the right time with coming in and having everything, that you could possibly need.
Right.
He's the man. As far as I'm concerned, he's still the man.
We're going to talk about Vern in just a second, but in retrospect, so many people say, "Oh, if Vern would have held on to Hogan, the AWA would still be in business," and blah blah blah. Was there any way at that time, in your estimation, considering that what the vision was that Vince had for the national expansion cable TV, was there any way Vern was going to hold on to Hulk Hogan?
Well, the problem there, from what I've heard, was Hogan all of a sudden became a big star in Japan also. And Vern Gagne wanted a percentage of what he was making in Japan, and Hogan wasn't willing to give up that percentage. So then Vince McMahon came and made him an offer, and Hogan said, he said to me that if Vern had given him, allowed him to keep the money he was making in Japan, he loved it in Minnesota. He loved having a normal life because we had normal lives there. Nowhere else did you have a normal life.
That's really something, because I think this is the first time I've heard. I knew about the Japanese money deal, but this is really the first time that I've heard, that Hogan, had Vern been a little more flexible and not so steadfast on the royalties from Japan, that he would have stayed there. That's really something. Yeah. Well, okay. So let's project that. Let's say Hogan stays in the AWA, but Vince continues on this expansion. Does it still happen? Does the success of the WWF still take place, maybe with a Piper on top or somebody like that, or was it all Hogan?
No, I think the success would have still happened because there was so many good workers, and whoever Vince chose, the way he promoted you, I think Vince was going to get you over, and I think that Vince would have made sure that Hogan didn't have anybody valuable enough to carry the load to work with Hogan in the AWA. I don't know if it would have been a little harder, but I think Vince was going to make it work no matter what. He had so much talent to choose from that he would have made it work with anybody that he would have chosen.
Well, and he certainly rolled the dice on WrestleMania, and we see how that played out. And of course, your match with the Executioner, Playboy Buddy Rose. You got the distinction, the first ever WrestleMania match. Just real quickly before we move on to the last couple of names here, talk about Buddy Rose a little bit in your interaction with him.
Well, Buddy Rose was one of a kind. He was another guy that was pretty big, that moved pretty good in the ring. Unfortunately, again, he was one of the other guys that went so young. I worked with him the first match at WrestleMania, which, at the time, Valentine and I had the hottest feud in the WWF. We were selling out big arenas. That feud that me and Valentine had, was over like $1 million. And I was in the opening match. I never realized how important it was to be in the opening match until later on. But I was pretty upset. It wasn't until right before I went through the curtains that Vince came up to me and said, the reason you're on the first match is because we need for you to set the tempo. We need for you to get the people off their butts. And that made it more important for me. And I appreciated, him coming up to me and letting me know before I went through the curtains. And, my attitude instantly changed before I stepped through those curtains, and I went in there and wanted to have the best match that I could have with Buddy Rhodes, which, talk about talent. He was very talented. He had a nice run in the WWF before WrestleMania 1. And he came back, I guess, to do us a favor, do me a favor.
And it's history. Tito Santana was in the first match ever at a WrestleMania. So that's good stuff there. Real quickly, let's talk about the AWA boss, Vern Gagne. Does Vern get a bad rap in the scheme of things. I know the other promoters kind of fell by the wayside once Vince got rolling. What's your impression working for Vern and then looking ahead? Was there anything he could do to stop the avalanche?
Well, I don't think there was anything he could do. The way he ran his territory, I mean, and it was a great territory. Like I said, we lived like human beings. He definitely knew what he was doing. At the moment, I thought there was a lot of other promoters like Vern and Bill Watts and the guy in Houston. I just couldn't understand how they couldn't get together and go up against Vince. But they had so many egos. They weren't worried about themselves. You know, they all thought they could do it, and they realized that they couldn't. Before you know it, they were done. I don't know what Vern could have done. You know, as good as he was, as good as all these guys were, Vince beat him.
Yeah, and I've heard so many times Vince, just like you said, watch the infighting, watch the egos. You know, the guys are sniping at each other, and you know when they tried to work together, that didn't work out because which of our guys is going to get put over on this show and who's main eventing, and Vince just watched, you know, the village burn, you know, and went from there. Last guy that I want to talk about, and I saved him specifically because arguably this is the one that got you on the map in the AWA, and that's our good friend Adnan LKC, who we just lost just literally about a week ago. That infamous incident on television with the dancing girl, where you know, she got a little too close to Tito Santana, and Adnan roughed the girl up a little bit. Tito doesn't like it and gets a sword from Adnan. Talk about the Sheik.
Well, that was the first feud that I was ever involved, and you know, that was the first time that I could really dig in to my interviews and talk from my heart when I would do the interviews, you know, because you know you had to make pretend that it was real life, you know, the attack, the way he treated her, the way he attacked me, what he did to me at the end, and it was in the summer, and you know, I wasn't too happy that the feud was in the summer, although we ended up drawing some pretty decent money for the time of the year there in Minnesota, and just the experience that I got from having a return match, and you know, listening to his interviews, and then me coming back, you know, that's how the guys used to do it. You know, you'd feed off each other's interviews. It was a great time. I mean, he was a lot more experienced than I was, so he kind of led me like a baby in the ring, and I was so grateful forever.
What a guy! Yeah, very, very sad at his loss, and
I didn't realize he was as old as he was. I mean, he was pretty good for his age.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. You mentioned, you know, Adnan's experience. You know, he had been in the business 20 years before you guys are working together. So that really speaks volumes. Yeah, so that I appreciate that look back at the AWA talent. I know, Chris, you've got to wrap up here.
Yeah, we just got a couple minutes left here, Tito. So we know you as, you know, the wrestler and you know, somebody that represents yourself well in terms of that business. But after wrestling, where did life take you? Like when you're done with the professional, your in-ring career, what was next for Tito Santana?
I was lucky that I had a teaching degree. I had a double degree. I had a physical education and a Spanish. I did physical education for 4 years, and then I did 21 years of Spanish, and I just retired on June the 15th. And let me tell you, it is so nice not to have to get up at 5:30 in the morning. You know, I had been looking forward, and the reason I wanted 25 years is because of my health benefits, and you know, that was the best thing I ever did. You know, I have a great pension. I waited till I was 70 for my Social Security, And my wife and I sit outside on the deck and talk about this, and we have a glass of wine, and we're very blessed.
Tito, I got to ask you. So Baron von Raschke, school teacher as well, had actually applied to become a teacher, but they didn't allow him the position because they were afraid if he got mad at the student that Jim Raschke would become Baron von Raschke. Now, you didn't have the same, in-ring personality as Baron, but I got to ask you, what was it? What were the other teachers and the students, who found out and knew that you were a professional wrestler? How did they initially interact with you?
Well, a lot of them were wrestling fans. I remember the principal that hired me in the middle school to be a Spanish teacher. He offered me a position to be the wrestling coach. And I said, he asked me if I wanted to be a wrestling coach, and I said, sure, I can teach the kids how to go like this, like Hogan. And he started laughing. Then he asked me, what about basketball? And I said, yeah, I was a good basketball player in high school. I said, and I ended up coaching basketball for 15 years. I'm happy to say that we had 2 undefeated seasons, and we ended up doing very well. And I used to tell my wife, it's not that I'm a good coach, is that I'm a good motivator. The kids would play their guts out for me. And I only had 1 losing season in 15 years, but 15 years was enough.
That is so great, and I just love it.
I could be a wrestling coach too.
Oh, that's fabulous. Tito, we're going to wrap things up here, but first of all, I've known you for a long time. We had that experience in the AWF with Paul Alperstein and so on and so forth. But to have you on the show, and last time I saw you here in the Twin Cities, you reminded me that we had reached out to you to be on the podcast, and I can't thank you enough. You are a consummate professional. I said at the beginning, and it's not, just it's a shoot. Everybody that I've talked to in the business over the years speaks so highly of Tito Santana.
Thank you so much for that, Mick. And I will always cherish our friendship, because you always treated me with a lot of respect yourself, and we always had a good working relationship. And I did feel bad when I first, there was a time when I was just very busy, teaching and still doing appearances on the weekends and taking care of my. I enjoy working on my yard outside. I take care of my yard and take care of home, and I just had to find a place where I had the time to do it, and I kind of felt bad because to say no to you kind of hurt me, but we got it done.
You're the man, Tito. We love you. Continued success, and on behalf of the crew, thank you so much. We're honored to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tito.
Thank you, Tito.
Joe, Chris, thank you guys. Enjoyed. You guys are true professionals.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you much.
Thank you, Tito. All right, there he is. Let's give a quick shout out, guys. Let's go ahead and you first, Mick.
Mark Peterson, photographer extraordinaire for the last 30, 40 years. Saw him in Las Vegas at Cauliflower. Great friend of mine. Hello to Mark.
All right.
My shout out goes to Pat Markson Saba. Pat was the accountant in the AWA when I was when the office was still open. She listens to the show, so just want to say hi, Pat.
And I'm going to go to John Coco 5199 on YouTube for always supporting us. If you haven't done it on YouTube, subscribe. It helps us out a lot. So we get about 30 seconds here, guys. We're going to take it home, and that was a great interview. That was great. Loved it.
Tito's one of my favorite guys in the world, and what you saw today and heard is what is the real Tito Santana.
Something that the world needs more of, and that is class.